20. The realms of Pharaoh. Dynasties 1 and 3. The single greatest change to have taken place during the second dynasty of kings was in the status of Pharaoh. Evidence from the first and third dynasties shows an increasing consecration of the office and, at the same time, a growing discernment of the existence of a realm, a super-geographic kingdom spanning life and death, within the region of the Lower Nile. That the royal role had been in a continuing process of development since the time of Narmer is best seen in the fast-changing burial arrangements of the kings themselves, the process that had first differentiated the tombs of members of the court from those of the rest of the population, and which by the beginning of the third dynasty had climaxed in the isolation of the king's tombs from those of all other people, and monuments so large that their construction had taken over the great part of the state's efforts and resources. At that same time too, a different image of the king had been created, the tremendous statue of King Djoser that was found beside his pyramid, a life-size masterpiece of stilled ferocity, with sculptural qualities unrealized by earlier generations. A subtle early indicator of the changing status of the kings had been the shift in their relationship to time. In the days of Narmer and his successors, specific royal events of tithing had been identified by the years of a monarch's rule, a process that had effectively inserted the names of individual kings into the court's food chain. Then, in the middle of the first dynasty, the compilation off list of the names of successive rulers had effectively extended the earlier role of individual monarchs as court providers to the office of kingship of itself. That such concerns had been genuine preoccupations of the court is shown, as we have already seen, by the two surviving king lists of the time, and also by the careful corrections made to the shorter of the two lists at a later date. That such concerns were widespread throughout the later parts of the dynasty is attested by no fewer than 10 surviving bowls and vases inscribed with the name of King Den, to which the names of his successors to the throne have been added, with some care by different hands at later dates. As the Aswan fortress testifies, these early redefinitions of the status of Pharaoh were taking place at the same time as the state was beginning to guard its enterprises, the same era, too, in which Pharaoh's northeastern networks were shrinking. The court was looking to local sources for its raw materials, and the royal workshops were producing masterpieces in extraordinary quantities. This period, therefore, the reigns of Jet and Den in the mid-first dynasty, was the time in which the court had started to create and cultivate its own cultural identity, to regard itself as an institution. And at exactly the same time, killing at courtly funerals reached extraordinary proportions. Such slaughtering, which also took place on a smaller scale at the funerals of some contemporary courtiers, appears to have begun quite suddenly. No one, for example, seems to have been killed at the funeral of the person buried in tomb. Human sacrifice in Naqada cemeteries having died out centuries before, when the focus for community killing had shifted to venues and living communities like the Oval Court at Hierakonpolis. Nor does anyone appear to have been killed at funerals on the el-Qa'ab in Narmer's time. King Aha, however, Narmer's successor, had a tidy regiment of 30-odd young men buried beside the royal crypts, and half that number again entombed by his funerary enclosures close to the Nile-side fields. Subsequently, more than 800 people, men and women, were immured at the funerary monuments of Djet, after which there appears to have been a slackening in the killing. So that in the time of King Qa at the ending of the dynasty, just 25 small graves were made beside the royal tomb. It is impossible, in the obscurity of the second dynasty, to determine precisely when this slaughter stopped. Briskly introduced and, as we shall see, mightily impactive, the fierce custom seems to have been abandoned by the king and his courtiers by the beginning of the third dynasty of kings, when the first pyramids were made. Such dark acts, however, threw long shadows. The politics of sacrifice. At the ending of the 2nd century AD, Tertullian famously observed that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church, that the sacrifice was fundamental to church identity. So, too, memories of the First Dynasty royal funerals upon the el-Qa'ab became a fundamental part of the later state's identity, and Abydos became ancient Egypt's greatest single shrine, a place of pilgrimage throughout the following millennia. Dozens of later pharaohs would embellish and enlarge the modest shrine that, in the time of the first kings, had stood within a settlement at Abydos and which had been rededicated to the state god Osiris, the ruler of the dead, who was also identified specifically with the dead kings. At Abydos, too, some of Egypt's most celebrated queens and pharaohs founded monuments of their own in a 2-mile line that ran along the edges of the fields to the south of the Osiris Temple. And from the compound of the Osiris Temple, close by the enclosures of the early kings, a grand, wide, processional way ran out across the desert to the ancient royal tombs upon the el-Qa'ab. Thousands upon thousands of more modest monuments, graves, altars and cenotaphs, built by people from all over Pharaoh's kingdom, were set up in the surrounding deserts. Sometimes on winter nights, so it was said, the dead could be heard howling in the wind that blows along the sandy gully in the cliffs, down over the ancient royal tombs and out across the living land. No wonder, then, that a common prayer of later ages was that the spirit of a dead person might join the annual pilgrimage to Abydos, or that burial parties would leave model boats and tombs all over Egypt, their sails rigged to take the winds that would speed their spirits on that sacred voyage. After some 15 centuries of such devotions, the tomb of Djer on the el-Qa'ab, where some 350 victims had been buried all around the royal burial chamber, was refurbished and re-established as the tomb of the great god Osiris, who by that time was regarded as a prehistoric king, as the sovereign ruler of the underworld and a god of resurrection. So when Amelino had excavated the royal tombs, his workmen had first to dig through the debris of millennia of piety, and in Djer's great burial pit, they found a life-size black stone statue of Osiris lying on a funerary bier which had been set inside a sarcophagus of fine white alabaster. And all around the ancient tombs were the remains of the Abydos pilgrimage, great drifts of broken pottery in the soft yellow sand, water jars, incense burners and dishes as small as penny pieces, which had once held a pinch of grain, whose sprouting was a vital part of Osiris' annual resurrection. Those dark archaic tombs with their framing lines of tiny graves had come to occupy something of the same space in the psyche of the pharaonic state as the earlier multiple burials in Naqada cemeteries had for those earlier communities. Yet the focus of these deathly dramas had entirely changed. Rather than the unique arrangements of each and every Naqadan burial, the regularity, the uniformity of this mass of little graves upon the el-Qa'ab, set out in straight lines all around the royal tombs, suggests that they were not designed to provide each king with unique resonance in the manner of the Naqadan tombs. Now, it would appear, the offices of the state rather than their individual holders were the intended beneficiaries, an impression reinforced by the fact that many of the victims of these burials, some of whom were named, seem to have served as officers of the court, or as members of a court household. These gatherings of secondary tombs around the great regal burials, therefore, were a literal extension of the order and offices of the living kingdom into the province of the dead, just as the great graves had been designed to hold the goods of the living state, just as the stamps and sealings of those goods served to delineate the range and reach, the space and substance of the court. So, these extraordinary assemblies were a simulacrum, a definition even, of the constitution of the great house, that is, of the offices of the pharaoh. King Djet's comb. Petrie went back again to Abydos in 1921, and pitched his expedition tents inside Khafre-Khafre's grand funerary enclosure. In the winter season of the year before, an expedition had uncovered some previously unknown graves of the First Dynasty close by, and further excavation, Petrie expected, might shed more light on the royal tombs that he had excavated some 20 years before. In this, though, he was disappointed, for the new cemeteries proved to raise more questions than they answered. A month or so of digging showed that the recently uncovered burials were but a small part of a series of cemeteries that had been cut in long narrow trenches in the desert, which were lined with parallel brick walls and subdivided into small partitions, each one of which had held a body. Such arrangements, Petrie saw, were reminiscent of the subsidiary graves on the al-Qa'ab, and these new tombs, he suggested, might have been a kind of overflow. In reality, however, more recent excavations have proved that Petrie had uncovered most of the graves laid down around 3 of the First Dynasty funerary enclosures, which had been built in conjunction with the nearby royal tombs and then apparently dismantled, one after the other. In his account of these excavations, Petrie estimated that, in the reigns of Djet, and Den, some 500 people had been immured in these linear cemeteries. Most of the surviving bodies showed that they had been carefully laid down in their 4- and 5-foot vaults, legs bent, arms gathered in the old Naqada fashion, accompanied by a cache of storage pots and a few personal possessions. That a few had been found in grotesque positions led Petrie to suggest that some people, at least, had been buried whilst they were still alive. A series of swiftly scribbled field notes hold Petrie's records of the intimate detail of these little burials. As the greater part were robbed, however, their clearance must have been depressingly repetitive. One grave, though, which he describes as having been made for a woman named Mariette, still contained some copper tools, a few small bone labels and a pretty little comb cut from a sheet of ivory. In the manner of the times, only the bottom quarter of the comb had tines which were exquisitely cut and were similar in proportion to those of the wider sections of a modern comb. The remaining surface, almost 2.5 inches high, had been reserved for the owner's guiding hand. And on one face of this elegant handle, golden with age and still shining from its ancient use, was a remarkable engraving. For inaccurate and vivid lines, a craftsman had engraved the name of King Djet on the ivory, Djet the snake, within a Serekh, with a hawk set on its top, to form an elegant little group that was balanced by a single so-called Ankh sign set beside it. And high above them both the craftsman had drawn a swing-hull boat of the type that had been painted in the tomb at Hierakonpolis, and on this boat, perched upon its cabin, there is a second, smaller image of a hawk. At first glance, the upper section of the composition appears to be an image of the pharaoh's progress along the networks of the lower Nile on which King Narmer had first stamped his name. Here, though, the king's boat does not float on the river, but has been carried up into the sky on 2 huge outstretched wings, which, as many similar later images will show, would come to hold the red disk of the sun. In the direct imagery of the early hieroglyphs, the small engraving apparently depicts the pharaoh as king of earth and sky, a message emphasized, perhaps, by the hieroglyphic images of 2 distinctively shaped staffs that heraldically support the outstretched wings and frame the royal Serekh and the Ankh sign, an image of a sandal strap that later scribes employed to signify life or to become. Later, those same distinctive staffs will come to represent the notion of stability. Here, though, they may well represent the fringing cliffs that frame the sky within the Nile Valley, the sky through which the royal hawk is sailing in the royal brigantine. If this is an accurate interpretation of those little signs, they represent an entirely different aspect of the pharaoh's kingdom, one not formed but evidence from the networks whose goods and produce filled the great graves of the time, but a part representation of the network's physical extent, along the living valley of the Nile, and from the river to the sky. Tithe and Sacrifice. Entire theologies have been erected round that pretty scene. In the light of later evidence, it is usually described as an early version of how ancient Egyptians viewed the universe in which they lived, a world under the aegis of a divine pharaoh who rules both earth and heaven and brings stability and life to the regions of the lower Nile, a universe, in short, in which everything under the Egyptian sun was part of a single sacred order, the order of the pharaoh. Yet it seems a heavy burden for a little comb to bear, made at a time when The courts of the early pharaohs were beginning to both guard and to regard themselves, when they were still arranging their millennial heritage to reflect their changing status. Its immediate purpose may simply have been to designate King Djet as the ultimate overseer of the valley in which state activity was taking place. At all events, the rare scene certainly identifies a new stage in the development of that concept, that considerable journey, in which the ancient colonies and trading networks of Naqada times became a kingdom. First, Narmer's name had been set inside a Serekh on his great stone pallet, so that it appeared, quite literally, as the occupier of a great house. Then, in the mid-first dynasty, the dual signs of a bee and a rush had been drawn side beside the royal name on some fine stone dishes, a composition designating, if later usage serves as an indication, that the king's realm spanned both the river's valley and its marshy delta, landscapes that the images on Djet's comb seemed to have extended up into the sky and into the living land itself. And at precisely the same time as Pharaoh's realm was in the early phases of its definition, at the same time as Djet's name was balanced on the little cone by a hieroglyph signifying life, so too 1,000 souls and more were being killed at royal funerals. Egyptology's traditional explanation of this sudden outburst of killings is that it represented the last knockings of a savage progress on the road to civilization. In this reading, the early kings and some of their most powerful courtiers had come to harbor the Sardanapalian desire to take their possessions with them to the grave so that their spirits could maintain the life they had enjoyed on earth. Thus, in this consumer paradise, they required attendance from their servants. It is not, then, surprising that, as the lines of little graves house more women than men, the doleful cemeteries at Abydos and Saqqara soon came to represent to traditional historians the inhabitants of an Orientalist herald that had been launched into the next world as if they were passengers on the bark on Pharaoh's comb. Though one might well doubt that, in a time of increasing royal exclusivity, hundreds of courtiers and servants would be killed to enable their participation in an ecumenical afterlife, the fundamental belief that the dead had continuing existence was certainly extremely old. Guy Brunton found evidence of offerings and funeral feasts in Badarian cemeteries, customs that were continued in Naqadan cemeteries, where the excavated pots of food and other goods provide further evidence that the dead were thought to have some of the same needs as the living and were, therefore, present in forms other than their physical remains. In similar fashion, the German expedition on the LQA Aswan covered just such an Opferplatz by tomb Uj which, so the presence of a fragment of an alabaster vase engraved with Narmer's name suggests, had been used to tend to the spirit of the tomb's dead owner long after the burial was made. At the nearby royal tombs as well, further traces of contemporary offering places have also been found. Such ancient acts of offering, of making direct contact with the dead within a specially appointed space, would become a primary function of the office of the pharaoh, just as the ancient act of killing had been a primary function of the royal office from its beginning, as is shown on Narmer's great stone pallet. And, as the picture plaques made in the times of Djet and Den all underline, such events were conducted in the royal name within the royal tithing courts, just as there were at contemporary royal funerals. Similarly, deadly acts had previously taken place within the cultures of the early Nile Valley in periods of stress, when the identity of a community was in a process of formation. So in Naqadan times, the focus of these dramas had moved from the graveyards of the small early settlements to courts set inside the larger, more complex settlements which were developing within the Naqadan heartlands. So, too, in the first dynasty, when the identity and culture of the royal court was in the process of formation, the long lines of little graves at Abydos and Saqqara represent part of an overwhelming dialogue that, like those which had always taken place within communities along the lower Nile, were carried out in images and objects, goods and chattels, flesh and blood. After the office of the pharaoh had gained an institutional stability and there was continuity in the royal court, so the killing had diminished. Then, later in the First Dynasty, as the practice of making little picture plaques with their records of killing, tithing and the restless royal round also disappear, so the killings at the graveside further slowed. And in the historical hiatus of the Second Dynasty, it appears to have stopped completely. Yet in the reign of Djoser, a large figure of a smiting king in the pose of Narmer on his palette, the first known monumental work by an ancient Egyptian sculptor, was engraved upon a desert cliff at Sinai, close by the mines. That would supply a great part of the considerable tonnage of copper chisels, which pyramid building would require. In later reigns as well, a line of similarly regal images would be placed on nearby rocks, that their inscriptions name turquoise, a green-blue stone also quarried in the area, rather than the tons of copper that were being extracted, serves to underline the contemporary importance of those gemstones that, unlike the copper that was used for tools, were elements of the royal regalia. These scenes of smiting on the rock of Sinai are often taken to show the physical subjugation of the local people. And yet, of course, they are the purest definition of a sacerdotal pharaoh, a post that had already been defined throughout the previous two dynasties. Here, then, is Pharaoh, the provider and protector of his realm, shown as the conduit linking the landscapes of his kingdom to this world and the next, a single image marking the physical and metaphysical extent of a new-made universe. 21. Two Gentlemen of Saqqara. Merka and Hesi-re, Dynasties 1 and 3. A great courtly drama must surely have been played out in the region of Memphis, where Djoser's pyramid now stands. And yet, despite a century and more of survey and excavation, the white walls of the settlements of the early dynasties still only glitter in imagination, for no trace of them has ever been uncovered. There is, of course, an extraordinary continuity at Memphis. Many of the 10,000-odd tombs in the vicinity of Aswan on the river's eastern bank, those huge cemeteries founded in the times of Naqada and emigration, had continued to be used throughout the early dynasties for the burials of a great diversity of court officials. On the west bank as well, on the plateau that lies between King Djoser's pyramid and the line of First Dynasty Mastabas that runs along the top of the cliffs, are extensive cemeteries of the same period, the greater part of which have yet to be excavated. And in the deserts to the north there are other cemeteries of this same period, mostly modest tombs sprawled over desert wadis, lying deep in drifting sand. The living settlements that once stood at the center of this vast arc of archaic graves, so it is generally agreed, must have been a considerable conurbation with dockyards and magazines that stood near the later city on the west bank of the river. By a process of deduction and core sampling, which has determined that the river in Narmer's time flowed nearer to the western cliffs than it does at present, the most likely site of early Memphis appears to lie a mile or so to the north of Djoser's step pyramid and in the wash of a considerable wadi, close to the desert's edge. Might this phantom Memphis, then, be termed a city? Not, perhaps, in the modern sense of the term, where commerce plays a fundamental role as magnet and provider for an urban population. But in the classical world, when cities were expressly founded to serve as entrepot and mostly thrived, it may certainly have qualified the manpower, materials and supplies required to build Djoser's pyramid alone would have required previously unseen levels of court traffic on the river. Nowadays, however, that energy has largely gone. The fields of the village of Saqqara and the town of El Badrashin stand by the mounds which hold the ruined palaces and temples of the later city that the ancient Greeks describe. Behind them both, a glimmering backcloth glimpsed through groves of shaded palms, Djoser's pyramid stands high above great screes of debris, the products of centuries of excavation on the plateau. Merka, the southernmost of the half-mile-long line of mastabas that stand on the cliff top of Saqqara, and the last and the most mature of all those monuments, was made for a man named Merka, a courtier who in life appears to have been concerned with the supply and conduct of the royal court and who died in the Reign of Qa, the last ruler of the first dynasty. Merka lived, therefore, in the period immediately before the early pharaohs and their courts all disappeared. Into the historical hiatus of the second dynasty. Well over 200 feet in length and more than 90 wide, and standing, originally, to a height of some 20 feet, the enclosure that once held Merka's Mastaba is the largest structure to have been excavated in this long line of tombs. Set inside several massive walls, two great buildings had entirely filled this grand enclosure. One of them, a maze of corridors and chambers reminiscent of some of the contemporary estate buildings in the Delta, seems to have been an elaborate offering place equipped with storerooms and is usually referred to as a temple. The other building was a mastaba, 120 feet in length, which, though its exterior of four fine palace facades was similar to those of the 2-century-old mastaba at Naqada, had no interior magazines at all, and was a solid mass of brick. Merka's burial chamber lay underneath the mastaba, a large and elaborate affair. It consisted of two small chambers cut either side of a single staircase. This ran down into a splendid funerary crypt whose roof had been held up by two massive beams which, following a colossal fire, had collapsed so that the brick filling of the mastaba above dropped down upon the ashes of the burial. When it was excavated by British archaeologists in the 1950s, fragments of human remains were found lying on the wooden planks of what appeared to have been either an enormous coffin or some kind of wooden catafalque, consumed by fire and subsequently ransacked. Even the huge stone portcullis that had blocked the passage to the burial chamber was smashed to pieces. The remaining fragments showed that the three subterranean chamber shed held some fine stone vases and dishes, some flint tools and quantities of storage jars and a few small jugs imported from the Levant, though it contained but a fraction of the quantities of goods stored in the similarly sized mastabas of earlier times. There was provision, in the shape of the elaborate temple which had stood beside it, for fresh offerings to be made at Merka's tomb after the burial was closed. And in a niche inside that building, the archaeologists found the feet and ankles of two standing wooden statues, presumably of Merka, set in a typical pose of pharaonic statues, with one leg placed in front of the other, of which they are the oldest known examples. The greatest of all the treasures from this courtier's tomb, however, was an enormous limestone stela that the archaeologists found lying across one of the mastabas enclosing mud brick corridors, spear-shaped, like some of the granite stele placed beside the royal tombs of Merka's time. The 6-foot slab holds hieroglyphics and a drawing of a man seated on a chair, a somewhat inept rendering of a relatively common image of the time. Beside, above and underneath this figure, however, there are no less than 7 lines of hieroglyphs, which, though individually ill-formed and inexpertly cut, are collectively one of the oldest continuous inscriptions to have been found in Egypt. Though much of their detail remains obscure, their burden was to name the owner of the tomb and describe his relationship to the king and his role within the living court. Even before the stela had been moved, the archaeologists were able to identify Merka's name by its proximity to the seated figure immediately below it, for in later times such images were used as a determining hieroglyph for the names of dead members of the court. Then, the transcription of several of the more prominent hieroglyphs set above Merka's name identified him as Iripet, which, as later occurrences of the same term suggested, showed that he had probably been a member of a small group of courtiers who were close to the king, and even, perhaps, a member of the royal family. Another section of the inscription further identified Merka as him, a word that in later times defined a group of people who performed some of the functions of a priest and who held senior posts in the regiment of ritualists who both accompanied the living king and specialized in robing sacred statues. In further confirmation of that role, Merka's seated figure seems to have shown traces of that same dramatic cloak of leopard skin which appears on images of the so-called Sem priests throughout pharaonic history. Taken literally, the term Sem appears to have been borne by a man who dressed the king in the royal regalia, that another of Merka's titularies apparently describes him as master of ceremonies puts one in mind of the little figures that accompany king armor on his pallet, one of whom, though unidentified by an inscription, also wears a leopard skin. In Merka's day, when the kings were still buried at Abydos, the activities of the royal court, as we have seen, seem to have centered on an annual round of voyaging and court appearances. These events, so the picture plaques of the first dynasty depict, involved acts of offering and slaughtering, tithing and presentation, marking out the years of each king's role in panoply, death and economics. At localities such as Abydos, Budo, and Hierakonpolis, such events appear to have been somewhat similar convocations. The monarch is shown bejeweled and crowned and surrounded by an array of costumed courtiers. A royal progress of tithe and slaughter that ended at the royal graves of Abydos. That Merka bore the title some, therefore, suggests that he performed functions at such royal appearances, which would have required a caste of specialists with the skills to organize the court and its regalia and account and circulate the goods it had accumulated. At this time, then, the roles of priest and body servant to the king may have been practical and indivisible, in the task of a royal inner circle, consisting, perhaps, of family members, people, at all events, who spent their lives in ensuring that the equipment of the court appearances, the crowns and costumes, the slaughtering knives and scepters, the throne, the record-keeping, the great boats and the architecture that marked and facilitated the royal progress up and down the Nile, was in good order. By Merka's time, therefore, at the ending of the dynasty, this core group would have performed the tasks of both tithing masters and ritualists. For such appearances, their images suggest, are properly described as recording pageantry, even ceremonial. This group, therefore, of which Merka was probably a member, would have formed a close society around the king and had an intimate understanding of the order of royal appearances, and a practical knowledge of the cycles of the rivers flooding and of the quantity and quality of the harvest that were the fundamental components of the court's survival. These, then, are the origins of the panoply and complex ceremonial of the pharaonic court. It is usually assumed that such posts as are implied by the inscriptions on Merka's stela, and there are many shorter, less informative examples of them were developed as a political means of governing an emergent state. It is an argument ex silentio. What in reality the archaeology shows is that the practical apparatus of this developing kingdom, the ceilings, ear tags and the like which ultimately served to record the amounts of food it collected, grew in sophistication with the enlarging court, whose organization was bound closely to the king and his endless round of tithe and offering. Serving and supporting the households of the court, of course, were the people who were visited and tithed by it, the farmers, colonists and craftsmen, who, as a later text observes, it was not good to harm, as they make everything. The descendants of the old Naqadan settlements, the inhabitants of various communities, dockyards and colonies, were now part of the culture of the pharaonic state, whose people, both alive and dead, were dependent on the produce of the land and, thus, the good order of its farmers and its network of supply. On occasion, those people outside the orbit of the court and the households of its courtiers and craftsmen, seem to have been called rekite, a term identified by a hieroglyphic sign of a lapwing, a bird that wintered on the Nile but which would later be regarded in the literature as ill-omened and even as alien, which may suggest that the modern notion of an ancient Egyptian does not equate with all of the ancient population of the Lower Nile. The rekite do not appear on Merka's stela. There are indications, however, that, even at the beginning, the relationship between the court and the people of the Lower Nile may have been somewhat fraught. The topmost frieze on the scorpion mace head, for example, was decorated with a ring of dead lapwings hanging from ropes, as if a gamekeeper had set them on a fence to keep the crows away. Tied to some of the standards that would be carried in the company of the king, Such images are reminiscent of the peasant's column with its impaled farm worker, which Dürer drew for Luther's delectation, and it suggests a certain courtly fear of the rekite, sometimes the later lapwing hieroglyph would show the bird with dislocated wings. Though only a handful of people are shown on the palettes, mace heads and picture plaques of the first dynasty kings, it is easy to assume that, like the images of modern rulers and their ministers, these little figures token the tips of considerable governmental structures, yet such need not have been the case. In Merka's time, the entire population of the Nile Valley was well below 500,000 people. Outside the Delta colonies, the land may hardly have been organized at all, and the king's immediate retinue only composed of a small number of people. Nor is there evidence that in Merka's day the communities along the lower Nile were held within a rigid, highly structured society. Certainly there were nobles in a court, tithing and killing, and the making of great tombs. Yet in reality, nothing more is known of Merka's time than what modern archaeology has recovered, and there is no evidence at all that what we now double royal court was an organization similar to that of the military, hereditary or property-based elites of traditional Western societies. This, after all, was a time when kingship of itself was a very new idea. Mariette and Hesi-re. British archaeologists had not been the first to dig at Merka's tomb. Over the ages it had suffered a variety of excavators, from early Christian stone thieves rummaging for building materials for a nearby desert monastery, to medieval treasure seekers sieving the Saqqara sand for grains of funeral jewelry, and, in the mid-19th century, the Frenchman Auguste Mariette, Egyptology's most passionate pioneer, who had opened Merka's burial chamber and left some telltale tackle blocks behind him. Mariette, a linguistic prodigy who had already catalogued all the hieroglyphic texts in the Egyptian collections of the Louvre, had arrived in Cairo in 1850 at the age of 29, and created a sensation when his excavations at Saqqara had uncovered a vast catacomb filled with enormous sarcophagi and a mass of bright antiquities. It was the beginning of a remarkable career. Over the next 30 years, the one-time journalist from Boulogne-sur-Mer went on to mount enormous excavations the length and breadth of Egypt, freeing many of its now familiar temples from vast mounds of debris, digging thousand upon thousand of ancient tombs, recovering great treasures, founding the first national museum of the Middle East in what would become the Service des Antiquités, encased in a great granite sarcophagus of his own and surmounted by a fine bronze statue. The tomb of Mariette Pasha now stands in the grounds of the Cairo Museum. Mariette's greatest single achievement was to stop the plundering of ancient Egypt that had started after the retreat of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt in 1801, when the remains of Pharaoh's kingdom had first been quantified and mapped. Beyond carrying off some of its prettier objects to their museums, the European powers had not known quite what to do with the extensive ruins of this newly revealed kingdom, and consequently bands of foreign treasure seekers had done more damage to its fragile relics in the following decades than had occurred throughout the two previous millennia. With the patronage of Ferdinand de Lesseps, who, with the encouragement of France, was engaged upon his scheme for financing and excavating the Suez Canal, Mariette gained the ear of Egypt's Ottoman governor, the Viceroy said, who in 1858 instituted a regime to protect and conserve the national monuments, and appointed Mariette as its mamour, its director. Now, as part of a 30-year program of conservation and mass excavation, Mariette returned to dig at Saqqara, where he discovered some of the most celebrated objects ever to have been found in Egypt. And there it was, just a few hundred yards from the Mastaba of Merka, that one of his work gangs uncovered a similarly enormous tomb that had been built, so its inscriptions told, for another courtier, a man called Hesi-re. In the 1860s, as Mariette was excavating at Saqqara, the early dynasties of kings were little more than a succession of strange names culled from the surviving fragments of Manetho's Aigyptiaka. Given that he found no inscriptions bearing a royal name within the tomb of Hesi-re, he could do little Woden lists the tomb as archaic in his publication, signifying that it had been made in the time of the pharaohs who had ruled before the Great Pyramid had been built. Today, however, we know that the Mastaba of Hesi-re was built in the reign of Djoser, whose pyramid stands nearby. Thus, like Djoser's pyramid, this courtier's tomb stands at the other end of the historical hiatus of the Second Dynasty, that period which had begun after the death of the courtier Merka and the reign of Qa, his king. Even bigger than the Mastaba of Merka, the tomb of Hesi-re had been one of the larger monuments that stood within a vast, dense and as yet only partially excavated cemetery of nobles and servants' graves, both large and small, that had extended from the cliff edge line of First Dynasty Mastaba as far back into the desert of the Saqqara plateau. Like Merka's funerary enclosure, the tomb of Hesi-re had been contained within a similar series of enclosing mud brick walls, which, on this occasion, had encompassed but a single structure, a massive Mastaba built in the old tradition, with a large and elaborate burial chamber system cut into the desert rock beneath. Here, too, the alleyways behind these enclosure walls had given access to a single narrow corridor that ran along the Mastaba's east face, the only one of its four walls to have been decorated with a palace facade. Here, however, unlike earlier mastabas, the centers of the 11 niches of this lone palace facade had held great thick slabs of dark brown acacia wood, each one as finely grained and vigorously veined as a panel of decorative marble. And each one of these slabs, so the surviving panels showed, had stood some 4 feet high and on their lower sections had held a sculpted inset panel. Each one of which, so their inscriptions told, had borne an image of Hesi-re, a tall young man with a short wig and a mustache, and often with a scribe's kit of pens, inks and palettes slung like a bandolier over his shoulder. Unlike the sorry images on Merka's stela, the figures of Hesi-re's reliefs had been designed to stand in open space, and just as the Naqada vase makers had used the veins in the hard stone to flatter the lines of their dishes and vases, so too the crisp lines of the figures of Hesi-re had been set against the grain of the acacia wood, the gentle curve of face and wig echoing his powerful twist and flow, set in an envelope of fine texture and high design. Even the most damaged image on the surviving panels still has its own life, an intense tactile quality of surface, the pulse of living things. Here, then, is that precise coalition of high formalism and direct realism with which later Egyptian craftsmen would always be especially concerned, and it was never better done throughout the following millennia. Above all else, perhaps, Hesi-re's reliefs display a joy of craftsmanship, of making things, of magically endowing heavy planks of wood with the qualities of life. The formal qualities of earlier sculpture have been largely stripped away to enable the description, with the aid of copper chisels and discrete abrasion, of a living chest, the exact quality of skin and muscle, a heart beating underneath a ribcage, an arm, a finger and an eye, even, perhaps, a sneer of cold command. Even the rows of hieroglyphs that accompany the images of Hesi-re are similarly endowed, like figures of the scribe himself, with the qualities of life. Though such intense and exquisite work is very rare, the pose and style of Hesi-re's reliefs are not unique for the time in which he lived. What in this instance encouraged these particular craftsmen to work to such extraordinarily skillful levels is unknown. In following centuries, however, some tomb owners appear to have taken considerable interest in the way the craftsmen represented them. Perhaps, then, Hesi-re himself had encouraged such extremes, examining each of the panels as they were being made in the craftsmen's workshops. Certainly their qualities could hardly have been assessed in their set positions in the Mastaba, where the mud plaster of the architecture obscured part of their carefully measured frames and the relief was cast in shadow in the narrow corridor and set so deeply in the niches and so close down to the floor that their viewing, let alone their manufacture, would have been well nigh impossible. At all events, the formal qualities of Hesi-re's surviving reliefs may now be seem to represent that fragile yet decisive moment in the culture of the royal workshops when the mature court style was first realized. At its best, it would remain a meditative art created by a small number of specialists working in isolation as part of the circle of the court, an activity that, in great part, seems to have been a private dialogue between the craftsmen and their courtly patrons. Such comments, though, treat Hesi-re's reliefs as if they were Western works of art, when in reality their placement in an uncomfortable and lightless gallery has nothing whatever to do with the modern roles of viewers, patrons and practitioners. Here, then, were worlds that we no longer know or really understand. Mariette removed the 5 best preserved of Hesi-re's reliefs for public exhibition in the Viceroy's growing collections, where they received the celebrity that they still retain within the Cairo Museum. Mariette did not, however, map or even fully excavate the tomb itself, which in consequence was swallowed by the sand again for half a century and more, until an elderly workman, Osman Dukmak, told the English archaeologist James Quibell that he had seen Mariette take the wooden panels from the side of a high mound of mud brick on the Saqqara plain. Quibell had gone to excavate at Saqqara in 1901. After his work at Hierakonpolis in the preparation of a catalogue of archaic objects for the newly founded Cairo Museum, he had become an acknowledged expert on the period. And, as a senior inspector of Mariette's Service d'Antiquité, planned to excavate an enormous mass of early tombs which lay behind the line of clifftop mastabas. It was there, at the largest of those tombs, in the monument that Osman Dukmak had remembered as the Tomb of the Wooden Panels, that Quibell found in one of the last baskets of debris that his workmen removed from Hesi-re's burial chamber, some jar ceilings bearing the name of King Djoser. These showed the reign in which Hesi-re's burial had been sealed and thus the king in whose court he had served. Now, indeed, the images of the 2 men, king and courtier, could be seen to share the same distinctive stone-faced demeanor and even the same shaped mustache. Quibell also found the sad remains of the other panels. Though part consumed by ancient insects, they were still standing in their original positions in the palace facade. This had been decorated, Quibell records, in the traditional way, and in similar fashion to the grand facades of Merka's tomb painted 2 centuries before, as a series of trompe-l'oeil renderings of wooden frames and rope bindings that held brightly colored geometric images of mats, such as might have been set up to make a screen within a garden or in the desert during a hunting trip. On the opposite wall of this narrow corridor of niches, and apparently unnoticed by Mariette, Quibell also found faint traces of some remarkable drawings of courtly furniture, beds, stools, sticks, cabinets and canopies, cloths, mats and gaming boards, many of which would not have looked in the least out of place in the following millennium, amongst the goods piled up in Tutankhamun's tomb. Another section of the same finely plastered wall held images of weights and measures, of oil jars, and boxes of tools, utensils and supplies, such as were trafficked in the court systems of supply. Here, then, draftsmen had painted images of the very goods that, in reality, had been stacked and stored within the chambers of the great mastabas of the first dynasty. Just a foot or so away from these careful drawings, half hidden beneath bulging lintels and set between the gaudy patterns of the painted rugs, the tender wooden reliefs of Hesi-re would have been barely visible. Yet, in the darkness of that corridor they'd been set up close to this enormous diagram, a visual stock-taking of traditional tomb furnishings. Between the 2 of them, between the living, breathing qualities of Hesi-re's reliefs and the painted spreadsheet on the opposing wall listing everything his spirit would have traditionally required the installations at the tomb's east wall had taken on a quality of magic realism, a quality that would have been enhanced by the placing of fresh offerings at the bottom of the niches, rites given architectural expression by the little maze of corridors and chambers set around the mastaba that led to the niches in its eastern wall. In the darkness of the tomb, images have been pushed hard against reality and are transforming into objects, words and sounds. And the wooden panels alone, image, word and object are transposed to the extent that, on one of them, the figure of the scribe carries the hieroglyphs that form his own name, Hesi-re. In his two hands, the distinctively shaped archaic has face in one, the rounded, sun-like disc, the re, in the other, rather than demonstrating a proclivity for punning, as this quality is usually portrayed. The designers of this transformative environment were dealing in a newfound language of writing and of image, one with dimensions that are both visual and metaphysical, and which in later centuries would be used to define and categorize the realms of life and death within the kingdom. Here, then, image and the written word have taken on a special power. In comparison to the massive goods stacked up in earlier mastabas, just a few provisions appeared to have been placed in the apartments of the tomb of Hesi-re, the bulk of them having been replaced by written and painted lists and facilities for future offerings. Hesi-re's spirit is served by words and images and a few chosen objects, and the relationship of all these categories one to another has been transformed. Order in the court. The burial of Hesi-re in such a large and splendid tomb suggests that he had been an influential member of the court. None of his inscriptions, however, describe him, as Merka was described, as Eri Pet, as a member of the royal inner circle. That he is often shown in his reliefs carrying a scribe's set of brushes and a palette suggests that the role of scribe may have been a significant part of his position. Translated in the manner of later inscriptions, some of the elegant hieroglyphs in his reliefs tell that he was indeed overseer of the king's scribes, but that at the same time he was the greatest of doctors and dentists and a captain of work gangs. That Hesi-re's own name may be loosely rendered as sun offerer, or worshipper might even seem to further gild the image of what at first appears as a master scribe and a prodigious personality. Yet in reality there is scant understanding of the precise contemporary significance of such terms which, though they can easily give the impression of being job descriptions, may have shifted in their usage down through the dynasties, just as, in the 17th century of the present era, a field marshal had been a subordinate officer charged with the organization of military encampments. In similar fashion, the origins of Hesi-re's appellation as Workong captain may well lie in the images carried by the little bands of standard bearers that accompany some of the figures of the kings of the first dynasty. It is a common designation amongst the courtiers of later centuries, one it apparently describes some of the posts of the supervisors of a wide range of separate units within the court, from pyramid builders to temple servants and divisions of the royal household. In the time of Hesi-re, therefore, when mature pharaonic society was still under construction, it would be misleading to take such translated terms at face value. All that the tomb of Hesi-re really tells us about its one-time occupant is that he was not of the same social group as Merka had been, but an official of the royal court and most probably literate, that either he or some of the members of his household were interested in the finest craftsmanship of the day, and that, as Quabel found in the course of his excavations, he may well have had a partner, a woman named by the excavator as Ankh-Fs, whose name was found in Azaire's burial chamber on fragments of stone vases, along with the disconnected bones of several individuals, some of whom were also identified as female. And yet, and more importantly, perhaps, it also tells us that the times, the very era of the society that Hesi-re inhabited, had greatly changed since Merka's day. Constancy and change. Although they lived a century and a half apart, there is considerable constancy in the burials of Merka and Hesi-re. Both were nobles of Pharaoh's court and buried close to each other on the plateau of Saqqara in tombs of traditional design. In similar fashion, the images on Merka's limestone stela and the reliefs on Hesi-re's acacia slabs are drawn in the same way and share the same essential subject matter, a figure of the tomb owner set beside lines of hieroglyphics naming the man and something of his status at the court, a traditional composition that was elaborated in the century after Merka and remained a fundamental feature of Egyptian tombs throughout the following millennia. Such images usually show the dead tomb owners with lists of offerings, a post-mortem system of accounting that is also common in the later courtly tombs. And on several of his panels, too, Hesi-re is shown seated at an offering table, loaded with bread, while some of the texts above his figure hold written lists of offerings. Yet though the two tombs show a constancy typical of the later kingdom, an accumulation of changes that occurred in the period between the times of Merka and of Hesi-re hints at huge transformations in the order of the state. The vast numbers of seal impressions that have survived from the first dynasty, for example, record the names of courtiers who, like Merka, were engaged in some manner in the traffic and supply of goods. By the time of the third dynasty, however, and certainly in the tomb of Hesi-re, the king's names alone appear on the preponderance of jar ceilings. By that time, as well, the records of the annual round of tithing and ceremonial which had been compiled throughout the period of the first dynasty seem also to have stopped. Such changes echo others in the structures of the court itself. In the days of Merka, the monuments suggest, it had been a relatively small affair, composed of men close to the king who were directly concerned with the provisioning of the court and who had accompanied the royal progress up and down the river. By the time of Hesi-re, the fundamental processes of tithing and supply seem to have been organized as they would be in later ages, conducted, that is, from a series of regional bases up and down the Nile in the manner of the offices beside the stone workers' workshops at Aswan. In the time of Hesi-re, indeed, those same court offices would have been engaged in the supply of 30 ponderous blocks of the dull red stone, weighing up to 12 tons each, to make King Djoser's burial chamber. Faint traces of similar offices have been uncovered in recent excavations in the Delta, whilst some surviving ceilings hint that just such a supply base may also have existed at El Khab on the eastern riverbank by Hierakonpolis. Here, too, if the titles on some seal impressions may be said to reflect contemporary circumstance, granary inspectors might have been operating as early as the Second Dynasty, and certainly, by the time of Hesi-re, a series of 5 mastabas, some of the largest ever made, were being built in the cemeteries of Beit Khalaf, a site close to Abydos, to house the burials of men who appear to have fulfilled something of the role of provincial governors. Ceilings from these tombs show that some of these burials enjoyed pharaonic patronage and further hint, therefore, at the extension of the royal reach beyond that of personal appearances at the ancient ceremonials of slaughtering and tithing, apart from the provision of materials and supplies required for the ongoing construction of King Djoser's pyramid, a work that, by itself alone, would have required the equipping and provision of more than 1,000 individuals. A newly developing regional network of supply would have encouraged the refinement of the state systems of collection and accounting, and thus prompted the need for scribes to transmit data, beyond the simple listings of Merka's time. Writing, as the seals from the lost papyrus scrolls at Aswan and several other sites appear to testify, had gained importance, beyond the increasing sophistication of the hieroglyphic system in contemporary inscriptions. Further evidence of a new emphasis on writing is the growing role of scribes within court society. Scrolls of sheep papyrus, a tough writing medium made of plant fiber, were certainly in use at the court by Merka's day, but there is no mention of the scribes themselves on the contemporary monuments. Images of later nobles, though, such as those of Hesi-re, who is the very model of a modern major courtier, are sometimes shown carrying a scribal writing kit and described, apparently, as holding positions in the court scriptorium. Life and death, it would appear, had changed with the systems of state accounting. Now, too, as the offices of court diffused throughout the land, signs of royal patronage increase in their importance. At the same time, the great cemeteries of the people of the farms and settlements seemed to disappear, along with the millennial Naqadan burial culture. When the hawk had wheeled, when Pharaoh's court had turned in on itself, The use of rare materials and the products of the mining and smelting industries were increasingly restricted to the royal workshops, along with the copper chisels that, from vases to pyramids, were essential to the production of courtly works. Such exotic raw materials as alabaster and cedarwood, granite, ebony, and gold were all procured by courtly enterprise, so that, by the time of Hesi-re, their employment in the finer furnishings of noble tombs and households was probably dependent upon royal patronage. Although the mastabas of men like Merka and Hesi-re appear similar, the circumstances of their creation were entirely different. The relationship of courtier to king had changed so much, indeed, that, by the time of Hesi-re, men like Merka would have seemed impossibly independent. By the time of Djoser's dynasty, the surviving tombs and pyramids suggest that there was a greatly increased focus and efficiency within the systems on which King Narmer's name had first been stamped. The scale of the enterprise had changed as well. In Merka's day, the tombs of courtiers had held the wholesale wealth of great estates and had been set up like lighthouses along Memphis's western skyline. By the time of Hesi-re, however, the royal tomb in the gigantic form of Djoser's pyramid had risen up to dominate that same horizon, and the sizes of the courtiers' mud brick tombs, though similar to that of Merka's Mastaba, were but a tiny fraction of the size of that enormous stone block building. Here, then, is the monumental differentiation between the fate of kings and that of their subjects, and one whose crisp, unmoving lines still loom over the dissolving mud brick monuments of the royal courtiers. Now, too, unlike those of Merka's dynasty, the monuments of Djoser's nobles occupy relatively modest situations on the desert plateau, like court attendants standing round a throne. And, if the inscriptions of slightly later monuments may stand as guide, it would appear that the desert plateau of itself was part of the royal monopoly. Tombs like Hesi-re's, therefore, signal the next stage in the transition of the pharaoh from chief officer of supply to a ruler, whose office is the linchpin of the living state and whose spirit after death had unique and even supernatural potential. It is the beginning of the mature pharaonic kingdom. Ars brevis. The craftsman's gaze had shifted. For the first time in Egyptian history, the craftsmen of King Djoser's time, for there are other monuments of those same days, though none, perhaps, as fine as those of Hesi-re's, show individuals made of skin and bone, living people whose pulsing bodies will change when their hearts have stilled and they are placed inside their tombs. It is as if pharaonic time, that new non-cyclic history based on the span of human life, had entered. The sensibility of the court workshops and the craftsmen's skills were now employed to scrutinize the qualities of living people. Such changes should not be attributed to some kind of technical, Vassarian advance within the craftsmen's workshops. The images of Hesi-re show no more evidence of improved craftsmanship or observation than, say, the Naqadan animal sculptures, and they are also built upon the same subtle balance of silhouette and interior form. In their time, however, society was changing. Traditionally, such striking visual evidence of cultural change has been taken as a symptom of other changes which had previously taken place in politics or religion. Yet in the deep silence at the very edge of history, there is no evidence of that at all. No evidence that such assumptions were the prime movers of that age. What is known, however, is that Hesi-re lived in a society in which the internal order of the early court had been overtaken and a new culture had been installed around the overwhelming image of the pharaoh, and that, without that figure, there would be no later state, no fine materials or tools, no pyramids, no images of the living man in Hesi-re's reliefs. Only the anonymity of prehistory. Now, too, there is a single order all along the lower Nile, a silent social contract whose viability within the confines of a tough Bronze Age economy was ultimately dependent on the office of the pharaoh and the Nile's phenomenal fertility, a contract in which a well-ordered population chose to live and die as part of the pharaonic order, a contract whose first draft had been manifested in living pageants in the figure at the center of the oval court. Now, though, the temper of the court itself had changed. In the days of Merka, the nobles' tombs of the Memphis region were engorged with provisions and supply but had relatively little of the finest productions of the royal workshops stored in the royal tombs at Abydos. Now, however, the tombs of courtiers like Hesi-re were not filled with the contents of great households nor the produce of their estates, but with far fewer, often finer things, the qualities of which had spread to include parts of the monument itself, more individual in their architecture than the monuments of their predecessors. The contents of these new tombs represent the more intimate aspects of their owners' lives and are increasingly concerned with different aspects of the living person. Hesi-re's reliefs, as we have seen, were probably made while he was still alive. It is as if, within the small society of courtiers, there had been a lessening in tension after the slaughter stopped. Though parts of Hesi-re's tomb survived, most of the reliefs and statues placed in other contemporary monuments at Saqqara had been taken out and sold to various European collections in the decades before Mariette began his work. The majority of the surviving reliefs are cut on limestone blocks rather than the worn wooden panels of Hesi-re's reliefs, and they are generally of lesser quality. Some sculptures, though, have something of those same rare attributes. 2. Near life-size limestone statues of a man and a woman with smudges of green-painted eye makeup bear similarly ambiguous epithets to those on Hesi-re's reliefs. A group of 20 stumpy-seated statues, whose courtly style, though yet emerging from a heavily archaic past, bears resemblance to the famous statues of the king. Their forms and manners would be echoed later on, in some of ancient Egypt's later masterpieces. Here, then, is Anqua. Well-built, thick-limbed, the granite statue's thyroid face is capped by a heavy wig. He has a boat-builder's adze slung on his shoulder in the same denominative manner in which the relief sculptors drew a scribbled palette on the chest of Hesi-re. Like others of the group, the half-life-size figure has been pounded from a hefty block of speckled Aswan granite, and Anqua's name is lightly cut into his linen kilt. Here too is another dowdy statue of a courtier, wrapped in the leopard skin of priestly office and wearing a necklace shaped like a circle with a horizontal line attached to it, in the form of the so-called Shen hieroglyph. In the times of Djet and Den, the same sign had been drawn on some of the picture plaques underneath a notched and curving palm rib, signifying the years of Pharaoh's rule. Later, the same round sign would also serve as the determining image for the phrase signifying the endless circuit of the sun. Later still, it would be stretched into the so-called cartouche that holds the names of kings. And there are princesses in this stony court, round-kneed, full-breasted, high-shining sculptures, one of them described as a true daughter of the king, pounded out of jet-black blocks of stone, their steady staring faces enlivened by thin chisel lines drawn with considerable artifice around their eyes and mouths. They also bear resemblance to the statues of their king. To the modern eye, this small community holds the beginnings of a formal definition of human individuality that you can also see in Hesi-re's reliefs. Queens and scribes, boat-builders and priests, all staring confidently ahead, the bright-faced members of a brand-new social order that, even as their tombs were made, was overseeing the construction of the first Egyptian pyramid.